Hey guys, it's Chris from Steeda, and today we're going to talk about what dual rate springs are and why they're so important in getting the absolute best handling out of your S550. We're going to go ahead and do a product review, and then an installation, and most importantly, a before and after on a slalom with these springs and camber plates installed with the proper alignment. So without further ado, let's dive in. When it comes to lowering your S550 Mustang, this is the way to go, especially if handling is a priority for you. You have these MagneRide Dual Rate springs paired with our Steeda Camber Plates. Starting out with the Steeda MagneRide Dual Rate springs, these springs are specifically catered towards your MagneRide vehicle. They're going to lower a regular GT 3/4 of an inch from factory, but if you have a Performance Package 2, GT 350 or 350R, it's going to be about a 1/2 inch drop because those are a little bit lower from the factory. The best part about dual rate springs is that they have a primary rate and a secondary rate. So when you're driving on the street, you're going down the highway, you're going to have that nice comfortable spring rate to, absorb potholes or bridge joints or anything that comes along the way on the street. It won't take away from that comfortable ride that you enjoy in your Mustang. However, when you start leaning on it, those back roads, the autocross, road course, you get into that secondary rate, it's going to give you the confidence you need going around that corner to handle it and get through the corner as quick as possible. Now, when you're comparing these to the MagneRide Sport springs, these are probably a little bit more handling oriented in comparison to the Sport springs. Those are going to have the drop you like, it's going to look great on the highway, it's going to look great at the car show. Don't get me wrong, these dual rates will too, but these are more about performance. These are more about handling. If you want to get the absolute best handling out of your MagneRide equipped vehicle, these dual rate springs are what you need. Now moving on from the springs, the camber plates. One thing to note is that in order to get a street alignment or relatively close to factory alignment with these springs, you can get away with your factory strut mounts. That's no problem at all. But if you want to take it to the next level, be able to dial in that camber for a more sport-oriented alignment or even a track-oriented alignment. One question we get a lot about our camber plates is why we don't include caster adjustment for our S550 camber plates. That's simple, because Ford already includes ideal caster adjustment right from the factory in the design of the S550. So don't bother messing with it. All you need to do is dial in that camber to what you need. The best part about these camber plates is that you can get a wide range of adjustment, from -0.3 degrees of camber all the way to -3.3 degrees of camber. And in order to achieve that -3.3 degrees, you can use our strut tower cutting tool to widen up that hole up top to give you even more adjustment at the top of your strut tower. But again, with these springs, you really don't need the camber plates unless you want to get the absolute most out of lowering your vehicle. And if you decide to add the camber plates later after the springs, you're going to have to rip apart your front struts again. So why not do it right the first time, get the camber plates to go along with it, and you'll be set to go. Without further ado, ready to dive into the installation, so let's get to it. Taking off the installation, it really isn't too difficult to do. We'll go ahead and start in the front, get this front strut off and out of the car so we can swap the spring into the strut along with our Steeda camber plates and get everything back in the car. Then we'll move to the rear. Starting off, GT 350 may look a little different than a regular GT or even a GT performance package with the MagneRide. However, it's the same concept. You want to get these Christmas trees out. And away from the strut because we plan to take the whole strut assembly out. There we go. There's another one right here. Same deal. There it is. Just get all this stuff out of the way. Now, as you can see, we've zip tied a couple things here because we previously installed a Steeda sway bar. We want to get those MagneRide lines out of the way. Because this sway bar is adjustable, it's a little bit longer than the factory bar. We want to make sure none of these lines rub up against the sway bar. So we'll go ahead and pull these zip ties off. Go ahead and grab that zip tie. Again, things may look a little different. But the idea is you just want to get this stuff out of the way. Then I'm gonna pull this Christmas tree out. And this is where your MagneRide shock actually, or damper rather, actually plugs in to the rest of the car. You want to be very careful pulling this out. And then you can unplug it. You can see right up top here. Unplug it and set it aside. This is going to come out with the strut. At this point is probably a good time to focus on the end link up here. We'll get that taken off. All right, may help a little bit to give yourself some extra room to wrench here. I've got an 18mm ratchet wrench here and an 8mm socket to hold the end link in place while you loosen things up. Ooh, this is cranked pretty good. There it is. One thing to note as I'm loosening this up, I'll mention it again when we pull out the factory strut, but fun fact is the MagneRide struts don't have, well, they don't have bump stops that need replaced. They actually have internal bump stops in the shaft of the MagneRide strut. So if you're wondering where that bump stop is, it's actually inside the strut itself. So you don't need to worry about anything there with these springs. And you go ahead and pull the nut off. What I usually like to do is pull the end link out. Give myself room again. Pull the end link out and put that nut back on there so you don't get mixed up which nuts go where. And again, you can just kind of set this off to the side. And at this point, you have everything loose and away from the strut to allow you to pull the caliper off, set it aside, so that's what we'll do next. Next up, GT350 brakes are a little different than the regular GT EcoBoost brakes. You have a different bolt here aiming towards the spindle from the outside. And that particular bolt is a T60 Torx. So you're gonna go ahead and, I'm trying to keep it square. There it is. So you work smarter, not harder. Breaker bar. There we go. Okay. You can go ahead and support the caliper from the bottom and set these stubborn bolts aside. Got the weight of the caliper on my right hand now. Go ahead and may take a little bit of strength to get it off the rotor. Then at that point, once you get it off, just go ahead and set it back on the subframe. And that's not going anywhere. Then you're ready to take the rotor off. Next up's the fun part. You want to grab a 15/16 socket, an impact if you have one. A 24mm socket would also work as well. You want to loosen these nuts, and we'll go from there. Let's back down the power on this thing. And once you have the nuts off, go ahead and turn them around Give yourself a good hammering surface. Yes, I said hammering because this is the fun part. The reason why you put the nuts on the end is so you don't mushroom the bolt at the top and you won't be able to get it out. So at this point, the reason why you're doing this is because the bolts are splined up top here. So they're pushed in and the nut pulls them tight against the spindle. The problem is getting them out. You got to hammer them through those splines before you can pull everything out. Some rust that usually gets in there and stuff like that. So the more miles you have, the more difficult this might be. Just take your time, be careful, keep an eye on the bolt here as it's starting to inch its way out, and eventually you'll get them out. Bottom one's out. All right, at that point, once you have both the bolts out and you've broken a sweat, pull the nuts off, set them aside. And you're ready to pull the bolts out. And drop the spindle. Once you have the spindle dropped, you can lower the car, and actually, you're ready to pull the strut out. Next up, you're ready to go to the engine bay. You have these 3 bolts holding in the strut mount and the strut assembly, all from the top in the engine bay. You want to loosen 2 of these completely, pull the nuts off, set them aside, somewhere where you won't lose them, and then gradually pull the last one off while you're using your other hand to hold the strut in place and gently pull it out. Use a 15mm socket. Put this around behind me so I don't scratch the paint. Next up, the fun one. So this part's probably the most dangerous part of the installation when it comes to doing lowering springs, but retaining your factory struts. The strut mount's holding that spring onto the McPherson style strut. The problem is everything's under pressure, and in order to swap that spring out, you need to use spring compressors in order to compress the spring, get the strut mount off, swap the spring out, and then put the strut mount or camber plate back on the assembly. It's under a lot of pressure. It's pretty dangerous in terms of swapping this out yourself. So we're going to show you how we do it here, but at this point we recommend taking it to a shop and having them do it as professionals. There's also other ways to do it at home, so use your own judgment. You have the separate spring compressors, which are probably the most dangerous. You have the jaw style, which you can get at your local hardware, automotive parts store, or the style that we have here, which is mounted to the side of a workbench. So we'll show you now. The idea here is you want to get some pressure off of the strut mount so you can pull this strut nut off. So go ahead, get a couple turns in. Then at that point, you're ready to get a 21mm socket and begin to take this off. Let's make sure it's the right direction. Set that aside. You compress the spring down just a little bit more to unseat the strut mount from the spring. Carefully pull these out. What you're going to want to do is reuse this strut mount here with your Steeda camber plate. Set that aside. We're going to loosen the spring up. Slowly but surely. And actually pull the spring out of the strut. And then next up, you put your Steeda spring in. The smaller coil on the bottom goes on the bottom. The larger coil on the top goes to the strut mount. And again, like I said earlier, you do not need to worry about bump stops as they are internal to the MagneRide cars. You can see the stop is right here on the isolator on the bottom of the strut. So that's where you want to make sure the spring butts up to this stop. And at that point, get a little bit of pressure on this spring. You shouldn't need much because after all, it is a lowering spring. You're actually gonna have a little bit more room to get that camber plate on. Next up, you're ready to put your Steeda camber plate into place. Now you will be able to move this camber plate around before installation. So it really doesn't 100% matter. But you do wanna make sure this isolator is orientated the same way. You can see here, there's a little divot in the isolator from where the spring was before. Line that up with your Steeda spring. You'll be ready to tighten this thing down. Now's a great time to talk about our strut nut sockets. It has a hole cut out in the socket itself so you can hold the strut in place while you tighten the nut down. You should never use an impact. As tempting as it is, could potentially damage the strut, especially an expensive MagneRide strut. That's not something we want to do. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do it. Go ahead and get the nut started. It's a nylock nut, so it will stop. What you want to do is hold this once you have the camber plate attached to the strut itself. You want to go ahead and pull those nuts and washers off the top, set them aside so you're ready to grab them when you put the strut in the car. However, you want to make sure this part of the camber plate goes on top of the camber plate, but before the strut tower. So you leave this on when you put it up into place on the car. You want to make sure that the pointy side of the camber plate is aiming towards the outside of the strut where the spindle mounts to it. There we go. All right, you hold it into place and carefully you get your washer started. Two should be enough to hold it into place while you grab your third. Get things started. After that, 17mm socket. You want to make sure as you're tightening, you just gotta be careful because it is a camber plate. It's going to slide back and forth in there. So you want to make sure the top of your strut doesn't hit your strut tower as things are tightening. Just get them started. Then at that point, I usually like to tighten these by hand. And again, try to keep that strut in the center. You can worry about the alignment shop taking care of your alignment once the installation is complete. Okay, you got everything tightened up top. Now you're ready to get the spindle mated to the strut. Same way it came off. Go ahead and put the strut up into place. The spindle does have some wiggle room, as does the strut itself. Just kind of line things up. And everything should fit like a glove. The bolt goes in from the front to the rear. So get that all the way through there. And go ahead and do the same thing for the top. The key to these spline bolts is that they will, you go ahead and put the nut on here, impact it tight, it'll pull the splines in like it's supposed to. However, you got to get the spline started, otherwise the whole thing is going to spin. So what you do is just tap it in. Get it started. Do the same thing for the bottom. Just enough to get them started. Now you're ready to tighten things down. Go ahead and get the nut started by hand. Make sure your impact is on the right settings. Go ahead and tighten things down. At this point, you're ready to put the rotor up into place. And at that point, you're ready to grab your caliper. With a caliper bolt handy, but you need both hands free to be able to slide this caliper on the rotor. It's going to be tight. Come on. There we go. Come on. Like I said, it's a tight fit. There we go. So go ahead and bolt the caliper back up into place. Get your other MagneRide wiring, your ABS wiring back into place as well. Jump to the other side of the car, get that finished, and then you're ready to move on to the rear. Now that we've moved on to the rear, we're ready to drop half of the subframe so we can get this spring out. Now we already have some Steeda parts installed on this car, so the IRS subframe brace will not allow us to drop that rear subframe unless we take it off. So we're going to go ahead and drop that first. If you don't have one of these, you can skip this step, but we'll go ahead and show you anyways. Go ahead and set the hardware aside. Next up, if you have the subframe braces, they're out of the way at this point. So next we're going to want to grab our 13mm socket, loosen up this bracket. Again, we're doing one side at a time, not both. I'm going to just leave these couple threads from the end. And at this point, we're ready to unbolt the subframe both here and up there. So you'll need an extension for up there if you're using an impact. First one's here. You can go ahead and take this all the way out. If you have your subframe bushing supports, make sure you don't lose those either. And then at this point, you're going to go up here, same socket, 21mm. And if you have the alignment kit in there, it might be a little difficult to pull the bolt out. Once you have that bolt out, you set it aside. Now the reason why we do this one side at a time, so we don't get the subframe out of whack. By unbolting the subframe on one side, you give yourself enough room to be able to get that spring out of there rather than unbolting the entire subframe and potentially screwing something up. Next up, your last line of defense is this shock mount holding the entire subframe up into place, at least on this side. So you're going to want to unbolt these guys. Be careful of all the MagneRide sensors and connections and stuff like that. You're going to want to unbolt these guys. They're 18mm bolts. Get your 18mm socket and go ahead and loosen them up. All right, in order to give yourself a little bit more room, you want to disconnect this brake line bracket. And just give yourself a little bit more room to get this guy out. Then, get a good pry bar. Find a place to pry down on the lower control arm. What you're going to want to do is pull down and get this spring out of here. It looks like the best way for it to get out of here is down and out through the front. This is your factory spring. Now you're ready to take your Steeda MagneRide Dual Rate springs and put them into place. You want the tight coils aiming towards the top, and the wider coils, or distance between each coil, the wider towards the bottom. You got your isolator. Again, it has a stop in it. Want to make sure where the spring stops is where that isolator stops. Actually, we could probably put that in after this is in the car. So the key there is making sure that you have the bottom coil in the correct orientation, because then at that point it slides right up into place. Once you have the spring into place, you're ready to start getting everything back together. There's kind of an order of operations here. You want to do this shock mount last. Go ahead and get these subframe bolts started. Best way to get the subframe into place, it's pretty heavy, it's kind of bulky and cumbersome. So get a pole jack, start getting the weight off of the subframe, and then you can kind of manipulate it into place to get your subframe bolts started on both front and rear. One thing to note, the pole jack goes on the subframe, not the lower control arm. It goes on the subframe. You want to grab your subframe bushing inserts if you have them. If not, this is a great time to pick them up and install them. Goes through here. It's not starting too easy, so we'll keep going up into place. You want this to be able to start by hand. And there you go. You do the same thing with the rear. That's going in like butter. Perfect. And at this point, you can start tightening things down. Go ahead and take care of that shock mount last. So get the bottom tightened up. These are 129 foot-pounds. So you can go ahead and get them started with the impact, but final crank should be with a torque wrench. 13 millimeter. Let's tighten up this bracket first. Get some pressure there. Go back to the 21. And do the same thing for the rear. You need an extension for that. At this point, you want to take the weight off the pole jack. At this point, you want to go ahead and grab a torque wrench. All right. What you want to do to tighten these down, it's 129 foot-pounds. There we go. There it is. Do the same thing with the rear. That should be it. Pull the pole jack out of the way. Lower the car. All right, once you have the shock manipulated up into place, kind of start the bolts by hand so you don't cross-thread anything. If you have MagneRide, especially on a 350, make sure that this spacer is behind the bolt where it was when you pulled it off. Just go ahead and zap them into place. It's an 18 millimeter. You got your little brake line guy. Get that started by hand as well. Last but not least, ABS, the speed sensor, whatever this is. Go ahead and put this back in. And at that point, do a quick check, make sure everything's tight and the way it should be. Tight, tight, tight. Everything's tight on the bottom. Repeat the process on the other side, and you're totally done. Out of all the Steeda suspension components we added to this GT350, by far my favorite has been the S550 Steeda MagneRide Dual Rate springs. Why? Because they're amazing. I didn't know it was possible, but this car actually drives better on the highway, just cruising down the road, less bouncy, nice and smooth. And then when you start leaning into it, getting from that primary rate in the springs to the secondary rate, like I did at Tail of the Dragon at Ponies in the Smokies, it just haunches down and goes. It's point and shoot. It's absolutely amazing, and I swear this isn't a sales pitch. I'm actually this excited about it. You tie that in with the camber plates, you're able to set your street alignment and then your track alignment. This car is gonna be an absolute monster once we get it out on the autocross track. Dialing it back to the before and after video, now this S550 GT350 out of the box is already awesome. Ford Performance did a great job with this car. But if you want to take it one step further, especially when it comes to handling, you can't go wrong with the dual rate springs and the camber plates. Now, side-to-side transitions, it's hard to explain, but I literally feel like my hands are controlling each tire individually when I'm turning that wheel. That's how connected I'm able to feel this car to the road. You combine that with the rest of the Steeda suspension that we have available for the GT350, and this thing's going to be awesome. You can pick up the dual rate springs along with the camber plates and a ton of other parts for your GT350 and S550 Mustang right here at Steeda.com. Go ahead and comment below. Do you have a 350 at home? Do you want to see more GT350 or S550 videos? Please comment below. We check all the comments, we'll reply back. We want to see what you guys think. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe and notification bell so you get the next video right up on your phone when we drop it. And don't forget the most important thing, speed matters.